Book burning is a series that I love, but I don't want to only make videos highlighting and poking fun at bad writing. It's very fun, and it might save a few egos down the line when someone remembers to put the fucking "and" in their extended list of bullshit, but I also want to try and illustrate good writing, because that's arguably more helpful to aspiring writers out there. Here, though, I run into a bit of a problem. What constitutes good writing can not only be incredibly subjective, but use of language tends to evolve rapidly, and it's impossible to account for style. What works in one style for one audience might not work for a different style or audience, and the distinction between these things can be frustratingly subtle. For example, I had a couple of choices regarding the style of how I wrote that previous sentence you just heard. I began with "in one style for one audience," which is slightly rhythmic, it's got some flair to it, accentuated by the repetition of the word "one." If we move along to the second time I mentioned style and audience in that sentence, I simply wrote "for a different style or audience," which is a much more direct and less stylish way of writing that section of the sentence. If I wanted to change the first part of the sentence to be more straightforward and utilitarian, I could write the sentence out as "what works for one style or audience might not work for another style or audience," which is quicker to read through, albeit it has no flair. If I wanted to do the opposite and keep the rhythmic style of the sentence going from start to finish, I could write "what works in one style for one audience might not work for a different style and a different audience." You'll notice I keep the repetition of beats going in roughly the same structure, this time using "different" as my repeating word. Playing around with the rhythm, style, and structure of how you write your sentences is something that most writers do just through experimentation. Trust me, almost nobody thinks about this stuff while they're writing most of the time. You can, if you wanted to, break down any given sentence to a frankly comical level of specificity, but doing so for every single sentence in a piece of writing is far beyond the point of diminishing returns. Instead, what I do when I'm writing is iterate through many similar ways that I could present the same collection of ideas as I'm drafting the copy. This usually involves exploring different forms of the same sentence, combining multiple sentences into one, splitting one sentence into multiple, and changing specific words or word order to try and settle on something that clearly illustrates my intent, sounds rhythmically pleasing, and is fun for the reader or listener. I'm by no stretch saying that my writing is necessarily good. If you don't like what I eventually settle on, that's perfectly understandable, but anything I publish has always been iterated upon extensively across multiple drafts. That's how writers typically operate, and there's a lot about the finished version that gets informed by the writer's own taste. Bringing this back to my example, the reason why I settled on the rhythmic phrasing at the beginning and the practical phrasing at the end is because I highly value variety in my writing. I try, even if I'm not always successful, to mix up the ways in which the listener will hear the ideas put forth so that it doesn't feel like I'm just illustrating things in exactly the same way all the time. That's not necessarily better than the alternatives I used as examples, that's just my writing style, which admittedly is also highly informed by the fact that the audience is going to be listening to me deliver it rather than reading it in their heads. This is what I mean when I say that good writing is highly subjective. Writers are all kind of just wandering into the ever-changing wilderness of language and exploring to try and find what works and what doesn't. However, that's not to say that a writer always just stumbles into good or bad stylistic elements out of sheer luck. It takes a lot of skill to effectively navigate the wilderness of language, and much like navigating actual uncharted territory, there are ways that aspiring writers can increase their chances of discovering a success through knowledge. If you take creative writing classes, of which I've taken exactly one as an elective unit, they'll recommend that you read and study the works of other authors in order to develop your own writing skills. This is great advice that you can replicate outside of an academic setting, and you don't need to confine your studies to classic authors. I write for a video format, so I've developed my style in this medium by studying the styles of some of my own inspirations on this platform. But I still find it generally useful for writing in all formats to study the great classic authors of prose fiction as well. One of the classic authors whom I think is a fantastic writer who is very much worth studying is Gabriel Garcia Marquez, who I'll be talking about today. I think I pronounced his name correctly. Okay, now, before you comment, Yes, I am aware that Garcia Marquez wrote his novels in Spanish and that I'm reading the English translations. Claiming that I'm showing you Garcia Marquez's writing style is incorrect, because the style had to pass through not only a language barrier but an interpretive one, as the translator themselves had to interpret the sentences in order to translate them. This means the translation will inevitably end up with stylistic differences from the original version. But I believe that this is only important if you seriously value an unadulterated authorial voice in fictional prose, which I don't. In fact, I'd usually prefer that an editor get their hands on the text. Most of Garcia Marquez's novels are represented in English by Gregory Rambassa, who was personally hand-chosen by Garcia Marquez, and Marquez even said that he prefers the English version of 100 Years of Solitude to the Spanish version. So, even though I can't read Marquez's unadulterated authorial voice because I don't know Spanish, I'll be referring to him as the author anyway, just because that's simple shorthand. Without further ado, let's get into this select segment from The Last Voyage of the Ghost Ship, narrated to you today by none other than Dragon Fox Girl, my wonderful, wonderful artist.
The liner corrected its course and passed into the main gate of the channel in a maneuver of lucky resurrection. And then all the lights went on at the same time, so that the boilers wheezed again, the stars were fixed in their places, and the animal corpses went to the bottom. And there was a clatter of plates, and a fragrance of laurel sauce in the kitchens, and one could hear the pulsing of the orchestra on the moon decks and the throbbing of the arteries of high-sea lovers in the shadows of the staterooms. But he still carried so much leftover rage in him that he would not let himself be confused by emotion or be frightened by the miracle, but said to himself with more decision than ever, "Now they're going to see who I am. The cowards. Now they're going to see." And instead of turning aside so that the colossal machine would not charge into him, he began to row in front of it, because now they really are going to see who I am. And he continued guiding the ship with the lantern until he was so sure of its obedience that he made it change course from the direction of the dock once more, took it out of the invisible channel, and led it by the halter, as if it were a sea lamb towards the light of the sleeping village.
The first thing you'll notice about this is that there are no full stops. The Last Voyage of the Ghost Ship is written all in one sentence, much like The Last Wolf by Laszlo Krasner-Hawkeye, except that the one sentence doesn't last 72 goddamn pages. Sorry, I just had to get that out there. The Last Wolf is honestly terrible. Getting back to the Ghost Ship, Garcia Marquez's decision to write the story in a single sentence was probably done for the sake of the symbolism and subtext, but it's worth noting that this does fundamentally change the feel of the story on a surface level. It lends itself to being read as a singular, totally unbroken narrative despite taking place over years' worth of time. Garcia Marquez really likes to compress large time frames into small chunks of words in his storytelling. In the case of The Last Voyage of the Ghost Ship, the story ends up feeling very dreamlike and could almost be interpreted as a dream, especially given the unreality of the story's events. What's happening here is a boy has seen a ghost ship, a cruise liner to be exact, that turns up repeatedly at night, runs into a reef, and sinks without making a sound or leaving a trace. His village doesn't believe that he's seen it, call him crazy and a liar, and also beat him up. He takes this as an affront to his identity as a growing man, and a mark of how he's being denied acceptance by his community. So one night, he rows out into the bay, comes into contact with the ghost ship, and beckons it towards him with his lantern so that he can guide it to shore. This passage is the moment in the story when the ship corrects its course towards the boy and starts becoming material. Before this point, it was a spectre, but now it's been pulled from the veil of unreality into the material world. At this moment, the full range of sounds, sights, and sensations that come from a massive ship full of passengers and cargo all crash into the world at once. The boy notices all this, but he's focused intensely on getting that ship back to shore, because all that matters to him is that he shows the village, he was right all along. Garcia Marquez's decision to write a single-sentence story really pays off in this moment, because it allows him to stack sensations on top of one another in rapid jabs with successive short and sharp clauses, each punctuated with an "and" like staccato. When you write a rolling sentence with lots of short clauses, the pace at which the passage is read naturally speeds up. The many "ands" introducing every successive addition to the action keep it rooted in a singular frozen moment in time, but with each beat hit by the narrator, the moment builds in tension like pressure in a kettle. It's like the action of the scene is wanting to burst forth. Our perspective on the scene only shifts when the narrator says "but" and returns us to observing the boy. The narrator then says he would not let himself be confused by emotion or be frightened by the miracle, which returns us slightly to the spectacle by describing the boy's possible reactions to it, confusion or fright. He then returns us fully to the boy's conviction with another "but," followed by directly quoting us the boy's thoughts using his own voice. We then return to the forward momentum of the scene with more clauses conjoined by "ands," although this time following the action of the boy guiding the ship to the shore. Because this action is not immediate and takes place over a longer period of time, we get longer clauses in between the "ands" to show the slower pace of the action. So basically, the lesson that aspiring writers can take from this passage is that you can control the pacing of a scene through how you structure sentences and the clauses within them. You can use repetitive "ands" to give a sense of forward momentum to an action within a scene, or to stack details and sensations on top of one another in a singular moment. You can also use "but" to reorient the reader's perspective within those crucial moments without the reader losing track of exactly what it is they're reading. And lastly, you can lengthen or shorten your clauses to adjust the tempo of your scene, making things feel faster and more immediate, or slower and more time-consuming. Here's the most interesting part of this passage, though. He began to row in front of it because now they really are going to see who I am. At first glance, this isn't anything unusual. The dialogue of the boy and other characters aren't encapsulated by quotation marks anywhere in the story, so you'll read this part assuming that the narrator is just stating what the boy's internal thoughts were. However, if you care to go back and read it again, you might notice that the word "because" is linking these two statements. "Because" is a conjunction, but here it's conjoining something that clearly the narrator said with something that clearly the boy said. What Garcia Marquez is doing here, I believe, is what academics refer to as blending reality and fiction together by joining the voice of the boy with the voice of the narrator. Creating this unease between the borders of objective reality and the fictional space within the text lend an unreliability to the focalization of the story. If the boy is linked to the narrator, then a feasible interpretation of the story is that we're reading the boy's dream, and if you're psychoanalytically minded, which I'm not, but regardless, you could try and interpret a few things about the character having this dream. Masculinity and adulthood are very clear themes of this story, as is colonialism and heritage. There are several references to colonial history, and the story ends with the symbol of a larger-than-life ship arriving on the beach of a native village. And there are many details purposefully omitted from the story, like names, that lend credence to the idea that the world of the story is incomplete, as though it were being dreamed into existence rather than existing of its own accord. Actually, now that I think about it, this is probably one of the least deep interpretations of a Marquez story that you'll find on the internet. But whatever, I'm not here to impress you all with my sick interpretive skills. I'm just here to showcase some writing techniques that I think are neat, which these are most definitely. Compressing and stretching time, keeping a singular sentence running, and conjoining the voices of the narrator and the protagonist will give you this eerie, dreamlike sense just as you're reading the story normally. You don't actually have to make any of the observations that I'm parroting in order to appreciate this story in this way. Heck, you don't even need to appreciate the story. You can just take these writing techniques and use them in your own work. That's why I'm pointing them out to you. Next, I'd like to take a look at an interesting example of how Garcia Marquez writes character interactions and dialogue. For that, we turn to Chronicle of a Death Foretold, and the scene where a widower named Zeus, I think is how that's pronounced, sells his house to Bayardo San Roman, I think that's how that's pronounced, who wants to buy it so that he can impress and marry a girl whom he fancies.
That very night, Bayardo San Roman went to the social club and sat down at the widower Zeus' table to play a game of dominoes. "Widower," he told him, "I'll buy you your house." "It's not for sale," the widower told him. "I'll buy it along with everything inside." The widower Xius explained to him, with the good breeding of olden days, that the object in the house had been bought by his wife over a whole lifetime of sacrifices, and that for him they were still a part of her. He was speaking with his heart in his hand, I was told by Dr. Dionisio Iguaran, who was playing with them. I was sure he would have died before he'd sell a house where he'd been happy for over 30 years. Bayardo San Roman also understood his reasons. "Agreed," he said. "So sell me the house empty." But the widower defended himself until the end of the game. 3 nights later, better prepared, Bayardo San Roman returned to the domino table. "Widower," he began again, "what's the price of the house?" "It hasn't got a price. Name anyone that you want." "I'm sorry, Bayardo," the widower said, "but you young people don't understand the motives of the heart." Bayardo San Roman didn't pause to think. "Let's say 5,000 pesos," he said. "You don't beat around the bush," the widower answered him, with dignity aroused. "The house isn't worth at all." 10,000, said Bayardo San Roman, "right now, and with one bill on top of another." The widower looked at him, his eyes full of tears. He was weeping with rage. "I was told by Dr. Dionisio Iguaran, who, in addition to being a physician, was a man of letters. Just imagine an amount like that within reach and having to say no because of a simple weakness of the spirit." The widower Xiu's voice didn't come out, but without hesitation he said no with his head. "Then do me one last favor," Bayardo San Roman said, "and wait for me here for 5 minutes." 5 minutes later, indeed, he returned to the social club with his silver-trimmed saddlebags, and on the table he laid 10 bundles of 1,000-peso notes with the printed bands of the State Bank still on them. The widower Xius died 2 months later. He died because of that, Dr. Dionisio Iguaran said, and he was healthier than the rest of us. But when you listened with the stethoscope, you could hear the tears bubbling inside his heart. But not only had he sold the house with everything it had inside, he asked Bayardo San Roman to pay him little by little, because he didn't even have a leftover trunk where he would keep so much consolation money.
So the first thing to remember is that the narrator is actually a character who is collecting testimonies from witnesses to a murder, and he's trying to reconstruct the events that led up to said murder. This scene was explained to our narrator by the witness Dr. Dionisio Iguaran, whom the narrator quotes directly several times. Dr. Iguaran isn't a participant in this scene, so our narrator is actually removed twice from a first-hand experience of this interaction between the two key characters. This allows Garcia Marquez to do some things that he couldn't get away with if he adopted an objective narrator. Because the narrator is cataloguing someone else's recollection, the dialogue doesn't have to be presented as verbatim. We as the readers can accept that perhaps the dialogue is a slightly misremembered approximation of the actual conversation that took place, but which hits roughly the same beats. This is a storytelling style that Garcia Marquez adopts quite frequently. I often describe reading a Marquez novel as akin to listening to a grandparent telling you a story from their youth. You know that the story is recounting a real series of events, but you also know that a lot of it has been omitted, exaggerated, misremembered, or misinterpreted by the person telling it to you. It might still be a fantastic and wildly entertaining story that you have fun listening to and might even give you some valuable insight, but it's far removed from being an accurate documentation of history. Writing this scene as a recollection also allows Garcia Marquez to keep the dialogue very concise and spend most of his words in the narration describing the emotions backing up this exchange. The scene is set up in a sentence. That very night, Beato San Roman went to the social club and sat down at the widower Zeus's table to play a game of dominoes. Some short dialogue takes place to establish the main crux of the scene. San Roman wants to buy the house. Zeus doesn't want to sell it. We go back to narration in order to explain why Zeus wants to keep the house. It's likely that Zeus's own explanation would have taken longer, so the narration is used to summarize it and keep the crucial points of the scene going. After the narration, Dr. Iguaran is quoted directly to show the reader where the information came from, and we're told why Dr. Iguaran witnessed the scene unfold. The narrator doesn't describe any interactions between Dr. Iguaran and the other men, because that's not the point of the scene. Using a second-hand account also allows Garcia Marquez to reinforce the emotion of the scene, not through direct description, but instead by having Dr. Iguaran comment on it himself. By having another character relay the emotions to the narrator, it solidly establishes that these actors were causing a bit of a scene, because this character thought it dramatic enough to comment on. You might notice that the quotes from Dr. Iguaran are a little longer and have a little more flair to them than the dialogue between San Roman and Zeus. Contrasting them this way, as well as having the scene dialogue be short and concise to a frankly unbelievable degree, lends to that disconnect between the narrator and an accurate portrayal of the scene. In this case, the reader's mind fills in the blanks that are deliberately left by such an incomplete recollection of the exchange. Garcia Marquez also condenses and skips over time in this scene. After the resilience of Zeus has been well established, the rest of the battle is summarized as, "But the widower defended himself until the end of the game," and then we immediately go to 3 nights later for round 2 of the exchange, not bothering to talk about how the participants departed after the first skirmish or how they felt in the intervening time. This is both realistic for the perspective we're viewing the story from, as Dr. Iguaran probably wouldn't have interacted with these two in between the bouts, and also lets the reader infer how they may have felt during this time by their attitudes going into the next exchange. Zeus would have briefly meditated on the offer, as well as San Roman's reasons for offering it, which is why he deflects with the jibing comment, "But you young people don't understand the motives of the heart," and San Roman, being thoroughly determined and persistent, made sure that he had the resources to fight Zeus on selling the house the next time they met over dominoes. The second time skip happens when we jump to "The widower Zeus died 2 months later," which lets us immediately know the tragic end to this transaction, and we finish off with a brief explanation of the aftermath with the assistance of Dr. Iguaran. Something that you'll notice about this dialogue is that a lot of it is summarized and skipped over, yet there's still a lot that Garcia Marquez leaves up to the reader to infer. It's tempting to call this lazy dialogue because Garcia Marquez hasn't taken the time to craft the perfect exchange between these two emotional characters in a crucial scene that changes both of their lives, but honestly, this is one of those less is more situations. Yeah, that's not exactly an intelligent way of phrasing it, but the point is to highlight alternative ways to convey dialogue in literature. To all aspiring writers out there, you don't have to imagine as though you're quoting your characters verbatim. If you adopt a non-objective narrator, then you can get away with an unreliable or incomplete account of events. Letting the reader infer the superfluous details from only the significant parts of dialogue can actually prove to give some readers a more novel experience. Human brains are extremely good at reading social cues, after all, and some people find decoding a fictional social exchange to be very cathartic. Garcia Marquez writes dialogue like this all the time in his books. 100 Years of Solitude is comprised mostly of incomplete or rapidly summarized scenes of important dialogue that interject a story that otherwise keeps up this relenting forward momentum. So to finish us off today, I'll give you a passage from 100 Years of Solitude that had me laughing my goddamn ass off.
He greeted Rebecca in the dining room, tied the dogs up in the courtyard, hung the rabbits up in the kitchen to be salted later, and went to the bedroom to change his clothes. Rebecca later declared that when her husband went into the bedroom, she was locked in the bathroom and did not hear anything. It was a difficult version to believe, but there was no other more plausible, and no one could think of any motive for Rebecca to murder the man who had made her happy. That was perhaps the only mystery that was never cleared up in Macondo. As soon as José Arcadio closed the bedroom door, the sound of a pistol shot echoed through the house. A trickle of blood came out under the door, crossed the living room, went out into the street, continued on in a straight line across the uneven terraces, went down steps and climbed over curbs, passed along the street of the Turks, turned a corner to the right and another to the left, made a right angle at the Buendia house, went in under the closed door, crossed through the parlor, hugging the walls so as not to stain the rugs, went on to the other living room, made a wide curve to avoid the dining room table, went along the porch with the begonias, and passed without being seen under Amaranta's chair as she gave an arithmetic lesson to Aureliano José, and went through the pantry and came out in the kitchen where Ursula was getting ready to crack 36 eggs to make bread. "Holy Mother of God!" Ursula shouted. She followed the thread of blood back along its course, and in search of its origin she went through the pantry, along the begonia porch where Aureliano José was chanting that 3 plus 3 makes 6 and 6 plus 3 is 9, and she crossed the dining room and the living rooms, and she followed straight down the street, and she turned first to the right and then to the left of the street of the Turks, forgetting that she was still wearing her apron and her house slippers, and she came out onto the square and went into the door of a house where she had never been, and she pushed open the bedroom door and was almost suffocated by the smell of burned gunpowder. And she found José Arcadio lying face down on the ground on top of the leggings he had just taken off, and she saw the starting point of the thread of blood that had already stopped flowing out of his right ear. They found no wound on his body, nor could they locate the weapon.
Now, I know that a lot of you probably didn't laugh, and I'll bet that still others of you are rolling your eyes at how silly this is, but I genuinely started laughing a lot while I was reading this on the train. Some of this humor is predicated on you having read the previous 137 pages leading up to this passage. Stuff like Ursula getting ready to crack 36 eggs to make bread is character humor. The joke plays on the fact that the reader would know that Ursula works harder and is more virtuous than anyone else in the Buendia family, and that the Buendias are largely a decadent motley of pathetic wankers who can't stop having children. So seeing that Ursula is about to start cracking a comically large and exact batch of eggs by herself to make bread for everyone is goddamn amazing. This type of humor is actually very well adapted for literary format. Holy Mother of God sounds like a punchline, but it's really not. Comedy in books is terrible if you rely on timing and punchlines. Just compare the original radio play of The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy to the novel adaptation, and you'll quite clearly discover that most of the jokes from the radio play are totally flaccid in the novels. It's not that they're bad jokes. I'm the biggest Hitchhiker's Guide fan that I know, and I think the radio plays are amazing and exceptionally hilarious. The problem is that the jokes, as they're presented in the radio play, are strongly hinged on timing and delivery. Timing and delivery are completely under the control of the creative team in a format like radio, but an author's control over the speed at which a novel is read is far more loose. You can sort of vaguely create a sense of faster or slower timing with the techniques that I've talked about today, and some other techniques, I'm sure, but it's pretty much impossible to get every reader to internally vocalize your writing to the kind of highly specific tempo required for comedic delivery. This is why punchlines rarely work in novels. Novels are far more adept at conceptual humor, which relies on the comedy of the situation or ideas that are being put forward. This is because in literature, the reader is required to internalize the voice of the narrator in order to experience the content. You can't sit back and passively watch the story be told to you like you can in film, which fundamentally is why film is a different medium to literature and not its replacement. Now, this does still need to rely on presentation. It's not like you can just think up a funny situation and automatically expect it to make people laugh on its own. So in this passage, we're going to be looking at how the funny situation is presented. The first 4 sentences provide the setup to the humor. They're mostly written in a very straightforward way. The clause, "but there was no other more plausible," is quite cheeky though, because it omits the word explanation and just leaves the word other hanging there expecting a noun. Leaving key words out of a clause or sentence that can be easily inferred otherwise is quite the playful technique. It's the literary equivalent of winking to the audience. You can also use this technique in sad or intense scenes to create a greater sense of drama, but it's honestly just kind of lame if you do that because everyone does that. If you keep stuff like this subtle, it can give your writing an aroma of cheekiness. It's quite good in getting the reader ready for the shenanigans that are about to happen. The line, "that was perhaps the only mystery that was never cleared up in Macondo is more character humor, although this time the character is the town of Macondo, where the bulk of the story takes place. The line, "As soon as Yosei Arcadio closed the bedroom door, the sound of a pistol shot echoed through the house," grounds the reader back into the scene of the action, and then the next line is another rolling sentence with cascading clauses. Like I said before, rolling sentences naturally speed up the pace at which the scene is read, which is essential for this type of comedy because it's predicated on the reader hitting the beats quickly, one after the other. Not with specific timing, although fast enough that they don't stop to think about it. Being bombarded with these absurd beats is, hopefully, what makes you laugh. A trickle of blood came out under the door, crossed the living room, went out into the street, starts us off on this rolling sentence, and it begins by not telling us that Yosei Arcadio is dead. We can easily infer this because the setup has already clearly told us that he died, but not explicitly mentioning it here leaves that particular image opened to be used at the end to round off the scene. Once we read that the trickle of blood has gone out into the street, we instantly know that this scene is crossing the line into absurdity. If you're familiar with the specific style of Garcia Marquez's magical realism, then you'll know that he mixes realism and absurdity fairly regularly, but even so, this transition from realism to absurdity is so discreet and obvious that it might catch you slightly off guard even if you are familiar with him. The next beat is continued on a straight line across the uneven terraces, which playfully contrasts the straightness of this random trail of inert liquid with the unevenness of deliberately built architecture. But the sentence hasn't stopped yet, so you read the next beat, which is went down steps and climbed over curbs, which is blatantly mixing the real and the ridiculous. You'd expect blood to travel downstairs, but how does a random trail of liquid climb upwards by itself? The juxtaposition by this point is creating the image that the blood trail and the scene itself are swerving back and forth. But the sentence still isn't finished, so you keep reading to learn that it passed along the Street of the Turks. And this might be a reference to something, but I've forgotten what it is. You keep reading past turned a corner to the right and another to the left, and you'll notice that each of those clauses is short. The rapidity of the beats in this sentence keeps you reading past the various steps of this absurd event, and your brain is picking up on a lot of oddities as you do so. Reading that the trail was hugging the walls so as not to stain the rugs will get your attention because trails of blood don't have intent. Why would it be concerned about staining the... But the sentence still isn't finished, so you keep reading without enough time to think, hopefully laughing all the way. Ursula is introduced into the scene in the final clause where both the blood trail and the sentence reach their full stop. When Ursula shouts, "Holy Mother of God," it reads like a punchline because this exclamation is immediate. Garcia Marquez doesn't write, "Ursula noticed the trail of blood, and when she did, she yelled, 'Holy Mother of God,' because that would grind down the quick pace of the scene. Instead, the paragraph breaks off, the shout gets its own line all to itself, and it starts and stops pretty much immediately, barring Ursula shouted, which is kept as minute as possible. That's what makes it look and feel like the climax to the scene, but then it keeps going. The next paragraph immediately begins another rolling sentence that follows the trail of the blood backwards, and I won't re-explain everything, but the part where it says that Aureliano Yosei was chanting that 3 + 3 makes 6 and 6 + 3 is 9 is another instance of the narrator's voice bleeding into a character's voice. In this case, we're still focalized in Ursula's perspective because Ursula is listening to this being said as she's following the blood trail. That's why it's not in quotation marks. As she moves past Aureliano, she can hear him practicing his arithmetic, but she ignores him and keeps to following the trail, and so do we. The scene ends with Ursula finding the body of Yosei Arcadio, which nicely rounds out the scene from the beginning that didn't explicitly mention the death or the body. The rolling sentence ends with the place at which the blood trail starts, out of his right ear, which mirrors the first rolling sentence and ties together the structure of the scene. After the rolling sentence ends, the scene more or less vanishes. The next line is, "They found no wound on his body, nor could they locate the weapon," which brings the reader's perspective into the future after people had investigated the body. That definitively ends the scene. Something that I really like about Garcia Marquez's writing style is that he knows how to keep the pace of a story up. He does this partly using two techniques: maximizing information density and compressing timeframes. If you want your writing to be information dense, then one of the ways you can do that is simply by cutting loose words and fluff from your sentences, which I myself picked up from a class in journalistic editing, and I've talked about ways you can do this extensively in my book burning series. You can also try to layer information and convey things through inference, like how I explained Garcia Marquez does for dialogue and character interactions. For another example, when I explained that the joke about Ursula cracking 36 eggs relied on the readers knowing Ursula's character, that joke in particular could be told in a concise way because the setup was Ursula's characterization, which the reader would already be familiar with. Compressing time frames often goes hand in hand with information density. If you're telling a story that spans long time frames, you can keep your readers from getting bored by summarizing large spans of time in a way that keeps the narration information dense. Keep in mind that one of the strengths of literature as opposed to film is that you don't have to give the reader information within the confines of an explicit scene. I talk about this more in my video on Grief is the Thing with Feathers if you're interested, but if you want to put this into practice, don't imagine that your narration is like a camera lens. Instead, imagine it like a speaker. Consider the many different ways that an orator could tell you your story rather than a camera, and you'll realize that time and space are a lot more malleable in literature than they are in film. Many times in 100 Years of Solitude, you'll find passages that tell their own minor stories that span days, months, or even years, but pack those long and detailed stories into a small word count. This is what makes the stories of Garcia Marquez so rich and dense, but they really don't feel like padding or exposition because Marquez writes like an orator who is always telling you all of these stories, big and small, about the town of Macondo and the family of Buendia, but never just lists off details mid-scene because he thinks you need to know them for some other purpose. These are techniques that can improve stories both on the surface level experience and for readers who dig deeper. If you want to improve your writing, the best way is to read and study the works of established great authors. Garcia Marquez is just one of them, but there are many options available to you in a wide spectrum of genres. If you want to write science fiction or fantasy, pick up works from seminal SFF writers and study their techniques. If you want to write romance, perform some close readings of the greatest works in that genre. The bottom line is, writing is a technical discipline that human beings have been mastering for thousands of years, so there's a massive well of accumulated knowledge and experience that you can draw from to develop your own skills as a writer. Go and build up your repertoire and have fun doing so. That rounds off this video on Gabriel Garcia Marquez's writing style. I know I'm not an academic when it comes to these things. I've taken a few classes on literary studies, but you'll honestly find far deeper and probably more informative stuff if you just take a writing course or something. I just like to talk about things that interest me, if I'm being honest. Feel free to strike up a debate in the comments if you think I got something glaringly wrong, which I frequently do. However, if you enjoyed this video, I and everyone who worked on this would absolutely love it if you took the time to like, favorite, and share this around. I also make other stuff on books if you want to check those out, and there's also a Patreon and a PayPal that you can use to help me fund this channel. Until next time, thank you very much for watching.